Welcome back, everyone. We're diving into some fascinating listener submissions today, all dealing with a topic that I think hits home for a lot of us. Talking to kids about money. It's one of those things, right? It can feel so loaded, so much easier to avoid.
Absolutely. And it's understandable why parents feel a bit hesitant, even anxious, to wade into these waters.
Mm-hmm.
We're looking at a whole web of concerns here. How do we answer those sometimes, well, really blunt questions kids have about wealth?
Yeah. Or like how much somebody makes, or like, why they chose the job they chose.
Exactly. And then on top of that, you have this underlying worry. Will our kids feel insecure or, the opposite, maybe entitled, depending on our own financial situation?
Right, right. So we're going to try and unpack all of this today, looking at why these conversations are so important now more than ever, and maybe more importantly, how to approach them. Where do we even begin?
Well, it might be helpful to start by acknowledging the emotional elephant in the room. Behavioral economics has shown us pretty clearly that how we feel about money, the pride, the shame, the envy even, these things really drive a lot of our financial decisions.
So we're already bringing our own baggage to the table before we even start talking to our kids about it.
Precisely.
Hmm.
And think about how layered it gets when you add in all the hopes and fears we have for our children, their future. So yeah, it gets complicated fast.
No kidding. And the world they're growing up in isn't exactly making it easier. I mean, look at social media. It's this constant feed of, well, everybody else seemingly having more, doing more.
Absolutely. And that feeds directly into this almost inherent human tendency we have for comparison. It can fuel a real sense of inadequacy, especially for young people.
Hmm.
But even setting that aside, think about some of the very real financial pressures they're facing. The cost of college is just astronomical these days. And we're essentially asking teenagers to make these huge decisions about loans, about debt, with often very limited understanding of how it all really works. And on top of that, you have things like health insurance, retirement savings, responsibilities that, frankly, previous generations didn't really have to grapple with until much later in life.
It's a lot to put on their shoulders. And one thing that really resonated with me from the material our listeners sent is this fear, sometimes unspoken, that parents have about their kids potentially facing downward mobility.
Oh, absolutely. And that fear, whether we voice it or not, definitely creates this sense of urgency. We want to equip them, give them the tools to navigate this increasingly complex financial landscape. And yet, what we often see, especially in more affluent families, is this epidemic of silence around money.
It's like the less you have, sometimes the more comfortable you are talking about it.
That's an interesting observation. And there are probably a lot of factors at play there. But the point is, regardless of income level, that silence doesn't serve anyone. As Jacob Swindle-Secour put it, keeping kids in the dark about finances can feel a lot like institutional adultism.
It's this idea that we're protecting them, but really we're just preventing them from understanding a reality they're going to have to deal with eventually.
Exactly. And then, of course, you have this big parental fear we see pop up all the time,
Yeah.
raising spoiled kids.
Yeah. Nobody wants that.
Right. And the piece we're looking at today, it outlines these four common characteristics. Kids who do very few chores around the house, a lack of rules or boundaries, constant parental intervention, doing everything for them.
And of course, tons of material possession.
Right, right. But what's really interesting is how the source flips this and says, okay, what are the values that represent the opposite of spoiled? Generosity, curiosity, patience, perseverance. And they argue that money, when used intentionally, can actually be a really powerful tool to teach these things.
Okay, so how do we make that shift?
Well, for example, involving kids in decisions about giving, about charity,
Yeah.
that can directly teach them generosity, the impact of their choices.
It makes them stakeholders.
Exactly.
One of the things that struck me from all this research, all these different families from, Mormon dairy farms to junkyard recyclers to wealthy families in the Hamptons to immigrant families, private school parents, working class kids at pawn shops, Bloomfield Hillbilly.
Bloomfield Hill,
It was all over the place.
Yeah.
And what struck me was that no matter what their background, their income, their culture, it seems like parents everywhere are grappling with the same fundamental questions. Like, when do we even start having these conversations?
Right. And how do we explain wants versus needs?
Yeah. And then the big one, how much is enough?
It's universal, isn't it?
Yeah.
And the source highlights, I think, really beautifully the importance of meeting our kids' curiosity with honesty,
Even when it's tough.
even when it's tough. Those questions about why some people have more than others. And I think it all comes back to this central idea. every conversation about money is also a conversation about values.
Yeah, it's not just about dollars and cents. It's
Yeah.
about what matters.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So an allowance tied to chores, that's about teaching the value of work, the importance of patience.
Mm.
Talking about giving, you're instilling generosity,
Yeah.
empathy, and helping them understand how to save. That's about delayed gratification, planning for the future.
It's about giving them a framework for making responsible, thoughtful decisions.
Exactly. And that's ultimately what we want for them, right?
Mm.
To be able to navigate this complex financial world with confidence and a strong sense of values.
Absolutely. So, to bring this all back to you, our listeners, here's something to consider as you walk away from this deep dive. How did your own upbringing shape your perspective on money? What messages did you receive, spoken or unspoken? And how can we, as parents, as caregivers, break those cycles, maybe rewrite the script for the next generation? Think about the specific questions your own children or maybe future children might have. How would you approach those conversations? And what values do you want to weave into those discussions? Thanks for joining us on this fascinating deep dive into the world of kids and money.